Hey guys, coL.QXC here today. I'm going to be talking about the cost of scouting. Should you scout? When should you scout? How much should you scout? How early should you scout? How late should you scout? And as part of my explanation here, we're going to just do this. So I've got 0 minerals, and I'm going to send one SCV to start mining, and I'm going to send the other one to start scouting. And this will kind of keep just so you guys can see how much money you're really losing when you send a worker out. So 1, and he's going to shift queue around the map and check all 3 bases. Obviously on a 2 or 3 player map, the cost of scouting is going to be less because you're not actually visiting all of the bases. And if you get lucky, the cost of scouting will also be less. But there is kind of a guaranteed minimum amount of resources lost when you send a worker out to scout. And this is, of course, assuming that you're not already above saturation. If you already had, let's say, 20 workers mining and you send one to scout, then the resources lost is not as bad. So the worker just pinged this base. It costs about 40 minerals, and then, of course, the worker would have to go back. So you're looking at roughly 80 minerals lost minimum when you send a worker out to scout. And of course, the more bases you're scouting, the more minerals you're going to lose. So then that comes back to the original question: is should you actually scout? Why should you scout? When should you scout? And basically the most important thing to keep in mind is deciding what are you actually looking for when you're sending a scouting worker out. In some cases, let's say command center first builds, you could send a worker out very early to scout, let's say, a 6 pool or a 10 pool. But generally a build like that is kind of making the assumption that that's not going to happen to you. And you kind of accept the fact that if your opponent's 6 pools, you actually just lose the game. And kind of the logic is like, well, why would you go for a super eco-heavy build if you're going to scout it, a supply early enough to defend some of these really specific all-ins and really specific cheeses? And so a lot of the times you just, players just take that chance. So going back to the game here, you can see the SCV has returned. Costs about 40 minerals, 35-ish, 30 to 40, depending on how precise you are and what your worker is actually doing. Most of the time when you're scouting, you wouldn't just poke in, you'd actually be looking around. So more like 40 minerals there and then back. And so basically minimum cost of scouting, about 80 to 90 minerals. And that's something you want to keep in mind when you're sending your worker out. And when you're choosing your build, you basically want to decide beforehand, like, what are the things that defeat this build? When I open CC first, I know that if my opponent opens 6 pool, I just cannot defend it. It's just impossible. Against Protoss, if I open CC first and my opponent proxy gates me, like, I just lose. And that basically is, it feels kind of unfair that you don't really have a chance, but in tournament play, the meta game here of what builds each player chooses is a competition of minds and predicting your opponent's tendencies. And so you can kind of lose before the game begins by being too predictable, especially when you're taking big risks like a command center first build. So as a ladder player, and so tournaments and ladders are very different in this respect, because in tournaments, you know who you're playing against, you're going to be playing multiple games against them, and you can kind of predict their tendencies and then play off of that to get the most out of your builds. You can open CC first on maps that generally you wouldn't let's say, when you're laddering, because you know your opponent's very unlikely to do something that will punish it. On ladder, especially with barcodes, and really just, unless you're at the top of the ladder, you're probably not playing the same people very often. And so everybody is essentially a fresh face. And so instead of trying to metagame the player, you metagame the skill level on the server. And when I say the skill level, you know, I've coached a lot of different people, and some of the lower leagues, bronze and silver, you know, I asked them, like, why are you scouting on 8 supply every game? And it's because they get 6-pooled half of their games. And so if you were in bronze or silver, you wouldn't want to open CC first ever, because the 6-pooled meta is very strong there. And likewise, when you get, there's a certain area in Diamond where, you know, the Protosses are more likely to proxy gate, things like that. And that's kind of what you want to take into account when you're choosing your build. And then in terms of actually scouting and when you should scout, scouting is a way to get additional information so that you can vary up your build or prepare an appropriate reaction. So the scout should be early enough to see what's coming, but then late enough that you're not actually negatively impacting your build. And this goes back a little bit to what I was just saying, is that you don't have to scout everything. It's just too hard, it's impractical, and it makes you too weak against all the other things. If every game you went CC first, you scouted on 10 supply because you were afraid of a 6-pool, you would be way behind against anything that wasn't a 6-pool or a 10-pool or whatever. And so when choosing your build, when you choose your build, there are certain things that you will just be at a huge disadvantage against. And you accept that, and then when it's kind of a more reasonable area, or at least where you're willing to make the concession to scout, that's when you decide to send your worker out and see what you can see. And you always want to have a clear goal. Obviously on a 2-player map, you already know where your opponent spawns. On a 3- and a 4-player map, the clearest goal is, where did my opponent start? Once you establish that, you want to be thinking about what you're actually looking for. Gateways, core, double gas, things like that. But that's not really, this isn't really a video about what you're trying to find when you're scouting. This is more a video about considering the cost of scouting. And then as a couple of examples here, it's really interesting to watch, especially the absolute best players in the world, when they execute certain builds, they just don't scout. And a lot of people think, like, oh, Bomber's a great example of this. Like, Bomber, oh, he's so risky, you know, he never scouts. And Bomber's very good at anticipating the strategies his opponent is going to use, picking strategies accordingly, and then maximizing the fact that he's not scouting in order to make his build just that much better. And a really good example of this occurs on a recent WCS match between Bomber and Pigbaby on Nimbus, where basically Bomber opens command center first and then goes 3 barracks before his first orbital command. And the only way this is possible to do that is because he skips the bunker and he doesn't scout. And that allows the build to still kind of line up the way he would want it to, but then of course at the expense of information. But then it's like, you know, you're opening command center first, 3 barracks. There's nothing you're going to actually scout for early on. And it was on Nimbus, so he had a barrack supply depot wall in. Very well thought out build. Makes a lot of sense. Basically, the whole point of this is anytime you have a worker not mining, you are losing money. And so you want to be mindful of not just following the timings of a build that you copy or a build that you come up with, but mindful of how your workers are being used, when they're not mining, when they're actually looking around for things, and how that can be negatively impacting your ability to defend certain things. There are some timings or things like that that will be actually harder to defend if you scout and see them coming. It's like the minerals you lost do not justify the information you gain. And that's generally not the case, but if you're looking for a good rule of thumb, scouting around 13 to 15 supply is about right. Anyway, QXC wanted to present the cost of scouting. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.